Have you ever stepped into a place where every gaze questioned your presence, simply because you didn't look like you belonged? Have you ever felt that? No matter how hard you worked, twice, three times harder than those around you, you still had to prove that you deserved your success? This is the story of Naomi Carter, a trailblazing businesswoman who built an empire with her own hands. She had everything: wealth, power, and respect. But on one fateful day, aboard her very own private jet, she was forced to defend it all. Why? Because she was a woman. Because she was a woman of color. What happens when prejudice collides with strength? When arrogance is put to the test against true power? And ultimately, who really owns the sky? Stay with me until the end, because this story will reveal a truth you need to hear. Real power doesn't lie in skin color or gender. It belongs to those who rise, stand their ground, and refuse to be diminished. You are watching Stories About Kindness. If you find strength in stories of resilience and justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support allows us to bring you more voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. Naomi Carter stepped into the private jet terminal with a calm, assured grace. The polished marble floor reflected the soft glow of opulent chandeliers, casting a scene of luxury and refinement. Men in impeccably tailored suits moved with purpose, while elegantly dressed women wheeled designer luggage across the floor. This was the world of the elite, the powerful, and Naomi was one of them. She wore nothing flamboyant. A perfectly fitted navy blue suit, her hair styled in a neat bun, and sharp eyes framed by long, elegant lashes. There was no need for extravagance, yet her presence demanded attention. She carried no excessive jewelry, only a high-end leather handbag and an iPad, her indispensable tool for business. Naomi approached the check-in counter, where Olivia Brown, a VIP service agent, greeted her with a polished smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I assist you today?" Olivia's voice was warm yet professional. Naomi offered a subtle smile in return. "Flight Carter 09 to Geneva. I'm the owner." Olivia's eyes swiftly scanned the screen. "Yes, Mrs. Carter. Your jet is being prepared. The captain will meet you shortly." Naomi nodded, taking a few steps back to observe her surroundings. This was more than a routine trip. It was a pivotal moment in her career. Her technology company was expanding into Europe, and the upcoming meeting in Geneva would determine the success of a landmark deal. From across the terminal, a man in a pilot's uniform approached. Captain Ethan Reynolds. He was middle-aged, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, broad shoulders, and the confident stride of someone who had long been in command. But when his eyes landed on Naomi, a flicker of something else passed through them. Surprise, doubt, appraisal. Naomi recognized that look immediately. She had seen it countless times before. "Captain Reynolds?" She extended her hand, asserting control over the introduction. Ethan glanced at her hand for a brief second before taking it, reluctantly. His grip was firmer than necessary, a subtle assertion of dominance. "Mrs. Carter?" he said, his tone betraying a hint of disbelief. "I didn't expect to see you here." Naomi arched a brow slightly. "And who were you expecting, Captain?" Ethan shrugged, forcing a thin smile. "Just, you don't often see a jet owner like you." Each word was carefully chosen, yet laced with implication, like small daggers concealed behind politeness. Naomi held her smile, but her eyes sharpened. "And where exactly do you think people like me should be?" Her voice was steady, void of anger, but it carried weight. "And where exactly do you think people like me belong?" Her voice was calm, devoid of anger, but carried undeniable power. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard for a brief moment, but quickly regained his composure. "I just meant, it's not what I expected." Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "That's fine. I wasn't expecting to meet a captain who seems so unprofessional either." The tension between them thickened. Olivia, still nearby, could feel the charge in the air. She swallowed hard, glancing nervously between the two. Ethan Reynolds was a seasoned pilot, well respected in the private aviation industry, but that didn't make him immune to bias. Naomi could see it, clear as day, in the way he evaluated her, in his probing eyes. This was not new to her. Men in boardrooms had underestimated her. Investors had doubted her capabilities. She had built her tech empire from nothing, becoming one of the most successful businesswomen in America. Yet, there were still men like Captain Reynolds who believed she didn't belong here. But Naomi Carter was not the type to let things slide. She crossed her arms slowly, standing tall, locking eyes with Ethan. I trust this flight will be smooth, Captain. I don't have time for nonsense. Ethan smirked slightly. Of course, Mrs. Carter, everything will be handled with care. But as he turned to leave, Naomi noticed his hand clenching into a fist. David Lee, the co-pilot, had been observing from a distance. His eyes flickered with discomfort as he watched the exchange unfold. What was that about? David asked as Ethan re-entered the cockpit. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. Nothing. She just thinks she's someone special. David frowned. She is. She owns the plane. Ethan gave a tight, dismissive smile. I've flown hundreds of wealthy clients, just not like her. David stared at him for a moment. He had worked alongside Ethan for a while now, and this was not the first time he had noticed this attitude. Back at the counter, Olivia let out a quiet breath. Something about this situation felt wrong, but stepping in, that wasn't her place. Naomi leaned against a marble pillar, eyes following Ethan as he walked away. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd have to confront this. She pulled out her phone, quickly typing a message to her assistant. Note down my meeting with the captain. If anything happens, I want a record. The message was sent. She took a slow, deliberate breath, calming herself. This was not the first man to challenge her, but it would be the first if Ethan Reynolds thought he could win. Naomi took a sip of the coffee Olivia had brought over, her gaze shifting to the runway. Her jet gleamed under the sunlight, a symbol of her success built with her resilience, intellect, and grit. It was hers. And no one, Captain Ethan Reynolds or anyone else, had the right to question that. Naomi Carter entered the exclusive luxury lounge reserved for private jet owners. Soft lighting reflected off the glass walls, casting a serene, elegant glow. She chose a seat by the window, offering a clear view of her jet, emblazoned with her company's logo, parked proudly on the runway. Her iPad was open, displaying the presentation for her upcoming meeting in Geneva, but her thoughts remained tangled in the brief confrontation with Captain Ethan Reynolds just minutes earlier. It wasn't merely his condescending look or veiled remarks. Naomi had faced enough battles against prejudice to recognize when something ran deeper. This was more than disrespect. It was a challenge to her authority. Ethan was testing her. In the world of private jet owners, power was not measured solely by wealth. It was measured by respect. If she allowed Ethan to undermine her today, others would see it as permission to do the same. That was a line Naomi refused to let anyone cross. The gentle click of heels interrupted her thoughts. Olivia Brown, the same VIP service agent from earlier, approached with a steaming cup of coffee. Your coffee, Mrs. Carter. Is there anything else I can get you? Olivia's voice was polite, but Naomi detected a trace of nervousness. Naomi looked up, accepting the cup with a faint smile. Thank you, Olivia. Everything's fine. Olivia pressed her lips together as though debating whether to speak. Naomi noticed. Is something wrong? Naomi asked, her gaze sharp yet not unkind. A slight blush crept across Olivia's cheeks. She shook her head, but hesitated. No, I noticed your conversation with Captain Reynolds earlier. It seemed a bit tense. I hope it didn't cause you any trouble. Naomi took a sip of coffee, letting the subtle bitterness ground her. You're observant, Olivia, and yes, there was a bit of an issue, but I'm used to it. Sympathy flickered in Olivia's eyes, coupled with a hint of embarrassment. I'm sorry if anything made you uncomfortable. If there's anything I can do. Naomi raised a hand gently to stop her. Thank you, but I can handle it. She knew Olivia was just an employee without the power to alter the situation, but her concern warmed Naomi nonetheless. She didn't need everyone to take her side. She simply needed someone to see what was happening. After Olivia left, Naomi picked up her phone and composed a second message to her assistant. Contact Michael Brooks, CEO of Elite Aviation. I want him briefed in advance in case this escalates. Naomi knew Michael Brooks well, the head of this private aviation company. He prided himself on flawless service and maintained close ties with clients like her. This was a network built on power and influence, and Naomi understood the value of staying one step ahead. Across the lounge, Captain Ethan Reynolds stood near the baggage check area, speaking quietly with David Lee, his co-pilot. Ethan's posture remained upright and commanding, but his eyes betrayed his irritation. You saw that, didn't you, David? The moment she walked in, acting like she owns the world. I've been in this job for 20 years and I've never seen an owner like that, Ethan muttered, his voice low but laced with frustration. David frowned slightly. Captain, she is the owner, and she's our client. I think we should just focus on doing our jobs. Ethan smirked. You're young, David. You don't get it yet. I've flown hundreds of wealthy people, but someone like her, no, never. David caught the undertone in Ethan's words. He didn't respond, but a knot tightened in his chest. He respected Ethan's experience, but this attitude wasn't right. Naomi remained seated, gazing out the window. Her private jet gleamed under the sun. Every bolt, every curve of the aircraft represented years of resilience and determination. Each flight was a testament to her defiance against the doubts and barriers placed before her, because of her skin color, because of her gender. But the sky belonged to everyone, and she had earned her place in it through merit, grit, and strength. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant confirmed that Michael Brooks had received her report and would monitor the situation closely. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. She was ready for any scenario. That was her style, never giving anyone the chance to control her. Taking a deep breath, she braced herself for what was to come. A battle was brewing, silent but real. But Naomi Carter was not afraid. The sky was still there, and it belonged to those brave enough to claim it. Naomi Carter set her coffee cup down on the table, her gaze fixed on her private jet out on the runway. Through the glass window, she observed the ground crew performing final checks, while Captain Ethan Reynolds and David Lee stood nearby, talking. She couldn't hear their words, but Ethan's body language, arms crossed, dismissive shrugs, and a tense expression, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't over. She sighed, not out of exhaustion, but out of recognition. This was the hidden labor that women of color like her carried, the battles few ever saw, the quiet wars fought outside of boardrooms, the constant need to prove their right to stand where they had already earned their place. And today, a man named Ethan Reynolds believed he could shake that foundation. Olivia Brown returned, her face slightly hesitant. Mrs. Carter, your jet is ready for boarding. I'll escort you to the gate. Naomi nodded, rising from her seat and adjusting her blazer. Thank you, Olivia. As they walked, Naomi noticed the flicker of concern in Olivia's eyes. The young woman had picked up on the tension between Naomi and the flight crew. Naomi offered a gentle smile to reassure her, though she knew this calm exterior was merely armor. The real battle would begin once she stepped onto that plane. At the foot of the aircraft's stairs, Captain Ethan was waiting. His face was composed, but it was the practiced stiffness of a man clinging to his authority. Behind him, David Lee lingered slightly back, his eyes reflecting unease as he spotted Naomi. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Carter, Ethan greeted her, his tone so formally polite it felt insincere. We're ready for departure. Naomi paused at the bottom step, locking eyes with Ethan. A heavy silence hung between them, thick, unmoving. She let it linger, then spoke slowly, her voice steady and deliberate. Captain Reynolds, from this moment forward, I expect nothing but the highest level of professionalism. I want no more questions or doubts regarding my place on this flight. I am the owner, and I expect to be treated as such. Ethan's jaw tightened. He gave a stiff nod, but defiance still flickered in his eyes. Of course, Mrs. Carter. Naomi ascended the stairs and stepped into the cabin. The interior was immaculate, plush cream leather seats, soft, golden lighting, every detail reflecting her high standards. But today it was not the perfection of the cabin that held her attention. It was the heavy, invisible weight in the air between her and the crew. Ethan disappeared into the cockpit, David following. Before the door closed, David glanced back at Naomi and gave a small nod, silent acknowledgement that he understood what was unfolding. Naomi fastened her seatbelt. Olivia approached to check on her, still carrying that same warmth and attentiveness, but Naomi could see that the young woman was not immune to the tension. Thank you, Olivia. Relax, I'm fine, Naomi reassured her, offering comfort to the attendant, but also reaffirming it to herself. The engines roared to life, their hum gradually building as the jet began taxiing toward the runway. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken, not out of fear, but from the awareness that this was more than just a flight. This was the final test, a subtle but crucial battle to determine who truly held control. The aircraft accelerated and lifted off, slicing through the sky. Outside, An endless sea of white clouds stretched beneath them, but inside the cabin, the tension remained thick and heavy. Naomi opened her iPad, attempting to focus on the upcoming presentation in Geneva, yet her thoughts repeatedly drifted back to Ethan. She knew his type. Men who had always been in charge, men who believed power was their birthright, and when they saw a black woman sitting above them, owning what they thought was theirs, they felt threatened. This was not just about race, it was a clash of status, a fight over who was truly in command. A soft ding echoed through the cabin. The seatbelt sign switched off. Olivia emerged from the galley, approaching Naomi with a glass of water. "Mrs. Carter, is there anything else I can get you?" Naomi accepted the glass with a polite smile. "No, thank you, Olivia, but I do have a question." "Of course, ma'am." Naomi leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "What are they saying in the cockpit?" Olivia's face stiffened. Her eyes widened in surprise as though Naomi had read her mind. I'm not sure, but I noticed Captain Reynolds seemed frustrated when he mentioned you. He told the co-pilot he planned to check the paperwork again, just to be certain." Naomi nodded, unsurprised. Ethan was still grasping for control, even up here, above the clouds. She placed the water down, picked up her phone, and typed a message to Michael Brooks. "We've taken off, but the issue persists. Please monitor closely. If anything escalates, I need immediate action." The message was sent. Naomi straightened her posture, eyes drifting back to the window. Below, the earth unfolded like veins and rivers, carving through mountains. Up here, at this altitude, power belonged to those who knew how to steer it. And Naomi knew. It was time to show that she was one of those people. She didn't need to raise her voice. She would wield her sharpest weapon, composure and control, because the sky was not just for men like Ethan Reynolds. The sky belonged to anyone with the courage to claim it, and today Naomi Carter would fly higher than them all. The jet glided smoothly through the clouds, sunlight reflecting off its polished metallic surface, but within Naomi Carter, the storm had not yet settled. Every faint hum of the engine, every subtle movement in the cabin kept her on edge. She had prepared for moments like this too many times, at negotiation tables, in boardrooms, and now on the very aircraft she owned. The cockpit door creaked open. Captain Ethan Reynolds stepped out. His posture was stiff, hands clasped behind his back, his face wearing the same rigid professionalism. Yet, in his eyes, Naomi caught it, the faint gleam of pride laced with defiance. "Mrs. Carter, I just wanted to inform you that we've completed a final check of all safety protocols. Everything is in order," he said, his tone polished, but Naomi detected the sarcasm that tainted his words. She looked up, her gaze sharp as a blade. Her voice, however, was measured, calm, yet commanding. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds, but I trust this will be the last time I hear the word check in reference to my flight. I was clear from the start. I do not tolerate unprofessionalism." Their eyes locked. The tension thickened, pressing into the space around them. Ethan clenched his jaw, then forced a tight smile. "I understand, Mrs. Carter." Naomi offered no response. She simply turned her gaze back toward the window, dismissing him as though the exchange had never happened. Ethan pivoted and returned to the cockpit, but his shoulders had lost their earlier rigidity. It was the first crack in his carefully constructed armor. David Lee sat beside Ethan in the cockpit. The door clicked shut behind them, but the tension lingered, hanging like a weight in the air. "You should let this go, Captain," David said quietly, his tone firm but steady. Ethan stiffened. He turned slightly toward David. "What are you saying?" David kept his eyes on the controls, his voice lowering. "I know you're uncomfortable with who she is, but we both know she's the owner. She has every right to expect respect. I don't want to see you push this further. It's not worth it." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped. The words struck him in a place he hadn't acknowledged, forcing him to confront the truth he had buried beneath his pride. He wasn't agitated because Naomi was difficult. He was threatened because Naomi Carter, a black woman, was in a position of power above him, in a space he believed belonged to men like himself. And that realization cut deeper than he cared to admit. He had grown far too accustomed to seeing white men in that seat, arms crossed, issuing commands, but today it was a woman sitting there. That reality made him feel small, as though his place, his authority, had been shaken. Ethan sighed, but the bitterness in his chest lingered. Naomi sat back in the plush leather seat, but her mind remained taut like a drawn string. She had faced men like Ethan hundreds of times before, those who never voiced their prejudice outright, but instead erected invisible barriers, quietly testing whether she truly deserved her place. But Naomi Carter had never let anyone define her worth. She had pushed through closed doors, shattered invisible ceilings, and she knew that to remain in this position, she had to prove herself over and over again. Not just for men like Ethan, but for women like Olivia, for young professionals like David, those who were watching, learning from her example. Her phone vibrated. An email from Michael Brooks, CEO of Elite Aviation. Mrs. Carter, I've received your report. We are monitoring the situation closely. Should any further misconduct occur, I expect you to inform us immediately. Customer respect is our top priority. Naomi smiled faintly. This was exactly why she insisted on having direct access to those in power. When you held real authority, you didn't need to raise your voice. You only needed to press a button. In the small galley, Olivia Brown quietly prepared a cup of tea, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the tension between Naomi and Ethan. For the first time in her career, Olivia realized she was part of this system. She had served demanding clients, witnessed powerful men issuing orders, but this was different. It was the first time she had seen a woman of color stand her ground, demanding respect in a space traditionally reserved for wealthy, powerful men. Naomi Carter had not raised her voice. She had not shown anger. Yet every word and every glance from her had been a declaration. She belonged here. It filled Olivia with admiration, but also a quiet reminder of her own place, small, almost invisible. She wondered, could she ever be as strong as Naomi? She lifted the cup to her lips and whispered to herself, maybe one day. The flight carried on in silence, but Naomi knew. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. She understood that the landing wouldn't mark the end of this conflict. Ethan Reynolds was still clinging to his authority, but what he failed to realize was that the moment he questioned Naomi Carter, he had already lost the most valuable currency in this business: trust. And Naomi would be the one to bring it to an end. Not with rage, but with something far more potent: justice. She looked out the window. The sky stretched endlessly, borderless, infinite. Up here, there were no ceilings, and that was where women like her belonged, higher, farther beyond the grasp of prejudice. The jet cruised on. But for Naomi, this was more than a journey. It was a declaration. This sky is mine. The jet began its descent, revealing the snow-covered peaks of the Alps below, glistening like scattered diamonds under the midday sun. Geneva was near. Naomi Carter glanced out the window, but the sight of beauty below did not bring relief. The true victory was yet to be claimed. It would only come the moment the plane's wheels kissed the ground. The seatbelt sign lit up. Captain Ethan Reynolds' voice echoed over the intercom, his tone still carrying that professional steadiness, though the firm confidence he once had was now noticeably dulled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Geneva. The current temperature is 7 degrees Celsius with clear skies. Please fasten your seatbelts. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, for flying with us. Naomi smirked faintly. Her name, this time, was not uttered with sarcasm. It was acknowledgement, or perhaps surrender. But she knew men like Ethan Reynolds never truly yielded after a single flight. They only understood defeat when what they valued most, power, status, and careers, was stripped from them. The wheels touched the runway with a smooth, effortless glide. The landing was flawless, as if none of the tension that had filled the skies existed. When the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin door opened, welcoming the crisp Swiss air. Naomi unclasped her seatbelt, rose, and adjusted her blazer. Olivia Brown was already standing ready, but something was different. The young woman's face now carried a blend of relief and respect. David Lee emerged from the cockpit, his eyes meeting Naomi's briefly before he gave a subtle nod. It was small, barely noticeable, but to Naomi, it was everything. It was an acknowledgement. You've won. Captain Ethan Reynolds was the last to appear. His face was taut, his eyes bloodshot, not only from the strain of the flight, but from the weight of the struggle within. He clung to professionalism, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed him. He knew what was coming. Naomi walked down the steps, her hand holding a sleek carry-on bag. She met Ethan's gaze. No words, no raised voices, just the silent exchange between the one who held power and the one who was losing it. Just before stepping into the black car waiting on the tarmac, Naomi paused. She turned back to Ethan. This time, no need to mask her message. Captain Reynolds, thank you for a safe flight. I believe this will be a valuable learning experience for you. Ethan froze. His jaw tightened, bitterness flaring in his eyes. But all he could manage was a strained response. Yes, Mrs. Carter. Naomi nodded and stepped into the car. The door closed. That was the last time Ethan Reynolds would ever be called captain on an elite aviation flight. Inside the cockpit, Ethan's phone buzzed just moments after Naomi had stepped off the plane. A message from headquarters. Captain Reynolds, please report to the Geneva office immediately following this flight regarding a customer complaint. You will be temporarily suspended from duty pending the results of the investigation. Cold sweat gathered on Ethan's forehead. He glanced at David, but the younger pilot simply shook his head. He had seen this coming all along. Ethan lowered his gaze. He knew he had lost. Not because Naomi Carter was a black woman, not because she was wealthy, but because she possessed something he lacked, an understanding of real power. Naomi Carter sat in the back of a sleek black car gliding through the timeless streets of Geneva. Her fingertips rested lightly on her phone as a new email appeared from Michael Brooks. Captain Ethan Reynolds will be officially terminated. We sincerely apologize for the unacceptable experience you endured. Elite Aviation will be implementing a new diversity and equity training program. We hope to continue serving you on your future journeys. Naomi smiled, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet pride of someone who knew a door had just opened. Not only for her, but for anyone who would walk into that terminal after her, whether they looked like her or not. Because everyone deserved respect. From a distance, Olivia Brown watched the car disappear down the road. Something had shifted within her, a quiet, resolute determination. Perhaps one day she wouldn't be standing behind the counter. Perhaps one day she would be the one walking through, head held high, just like Naomi Carter. David Lee stepped off the jet, inhaling the crisp Swiss air. He realized he had learned more on this flight than he ever had in his training. It wasn't about piloting skills. It was about respect. Later that evening, Naomi entered her hotel room, gazing out at the cobbled streets and historic buildings of Geneva. The city stood firm, weathered by time, yet standing strong, just like her journey. Step by step, through every barrier, never stopping. Her phone buzzed, a message from Olivia. Thank you. I learned so much today, wishing you a wonderful evening. Naomi smiled. Beyond the window, the sky stretched endlessly into the horizon, and women like her, people like her, would continue to soar higher and farther, not to prove themselves, but because that was where they belonged. The sky belonged to everyone, and true power always lay in the hands of those who held on to it with resilience and dignity. If you've ever felt underestimated, doubted because of where you come from, the color of your skin, or your gender, remember this. True power lies in your resilience and determination. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you more inspiring stories. Thank you for listening, and always remember, the sky is yours.